Bill here, where we're going to explore cable management using a fractal arc case. This case has a lot of cable management features to it. Cable management being the latest buzz these days to allow all the cables to be neatly tucked away, to allow free airflow throughout your case to keep things nice and cool. Look, Ma, no cables. The only two cables that are here that come directly from the power supply, which is a 750 watt Antec bronze certified, is the PCI Express for the graphics card and the data cable running up to the DVD player. Okay, here we are with the side panel removed, and you can see all this cable management and in its completed state. And again, the whole idea here is all of this plethora of cables is nice and neatly tucked out of the way of your airflow on the other side of the case. Some of the key features to look for when looking for a case that you want to do cable management with is the space between this motherboard panel and the side panel here. This case has about an inch, allowing for these cables to be neatly tucked away, not bulging out your side panel. The other thing is the ports. A lot of the cases do come with ports, but they don't have the grommets. This particular case does have these nice rubberized grommets sitting in there, and even if it doesn't, you could probably put some sort of tubing that you could slit around the circumference to keep any sort of chaffing going on with your cables. The 90-degree hard drive bays, again 90 degrees to the normal configuration, allowing the cables to be coming through the panel and into the back of the hard drives. And hold down points. You certainly want lots of hold down points. You really can't see them here, but a lot of these zip ties are tied down to hold down points. This case came with a lot of them in this area, but unfortunately none over in this area where it could have certainly used some. There are ports up here at the top, mid, and bottom, but again the hold down points only exist in this main area here. Even though I've got a lot of cables tucked away over here, they just tend to naturally stay there, and of course they'll be held there when the side panel goes on. So the process that I used was, it's fairly simple. It's really just trial and error. And I started off with all of the cables on the other side of the case, so anything coming out of that power supply was on the other side, and I just pulled them through one by one and routed them around and, you know, tried to fit them up. What I would start off doing is I started off pulling the main power supply through, and I would loosely tie it to the hold down points. I ended up going out of this top port here because that's the closest to the connector on the motherboard. And again, I tried not to overstress either the connectors or the cables. Don't try to make them to do things that they don't want to naturally do. And as you fiddle around with it, you'll see where a cable will more naturally lay in one direction or in one position than in another. So again, loosely tied down to allow for adjustments, and then when I finally do have it, I'll go ahead and I'll pull the zip tight, and then I'll pull through another cable. So for example, the 8-pin power supply for the motherboard that routes up through here and out through this port, I'll end up routing that next, and I'll just loosely tie it either to the cable or put the zip ties through the hold downs again. And then through that process, once I've gotten where I want this cable to lay, I'll tighten them up, and I'll just clip off the zips that are no longer needed, not doubling up on them. And through this process, you end up going through a lot of zip ties. I probably went through a couple of dozen that, you know, as I would tighten down new cables and play around with an experiment, I would end up snipping them off and throwing them away. For the hard drives, what I ended up doing was finding what is the number of bays spacing that was needed in order to get the power supply such that the connectors weren't overly stressed out, and this ended up becoming a nice arrangement. And you can even see here with the data cables, I've got these nicely coiled up and tied so that there's not a lot of cable floating around, flapping around there. And for all of the extra cables, what I ended up doing was laying them down in this area, and again, you'll see how they'll naturally fold given the connectors, and ended up tying those either to itself or just laying it on top of itself, and it worked out fairly nicely. For the main motherboard power supply, you can see that it came out through this top port up here, and it's nicely looped, nice radius on that, and then plugs into the motherboard. Again, I didn't try to overstress or overdo the bends on the cables to keep from stressing out the connectors on the board. You can see that this top port was also used for the power supply for the DVD player, but its SATA cable doesn't go through there. It's nicely looped instead on itself and then plugged into the motherboard. For the hard drive SATA cables, I did want to use the port, and they were taking an angle that probably they wouldn't naturally do, and you can't use the 90-degree ends on the motherboard, so I ended up just heating them up with a heat gun and wrapping them around a 3/8" dowel to help form them so that they would stay in this curved position. So again, minimizing or eliminating the stress. For airflow through this box, a total of 6 12-centimeter fans, 2 in the front as intakes, 1 at the bottom also as an intake, again providing a lot of airflow across that large ASUS graphics card heat pipe cooler. 3 exhaust fans, 1 in the back and 2 at the top. So the only fan that is plugged into the motherboard is in fact the CPU fan, and even that cable, as you can see, is nicely routed and tied up on itself in order to have a good clean look. For a side-by-side comparison, here's that fractal arc case we've been looking at, and sitting right next to it is another case that touts cable management, but as you can see, all of the cables here are in fact and indeed routed in the front. The back side of the arc case, the back side of this case that supposedly had cable management. Not even a 1/4 of an inch exists in between the motherboard back panel and the side panel, and the only hold down points are here and here, with a couple of ports to route cables through, but again, no grommet. You could chaff your cables, and as you can see, the hard drive bays are not turned 90 degrees. Just a couple of quick close-ups of this other box. Even though it's not a true cable management box, that doesn't stop you from doing proper cable management. As you can see here, some of the fan power leads all nicely looped up amongst themselves and bundled up in such a way as to preclude any interference with the fans. And there's all of the front panel connectors, and again, everything else nicely tied together. Again, no stress points. Make sure that you have good enough radiuses on the cables when you loop them back on themselves so that they don't end up crimping. And still, overall, a nice build. So thank you for joining me. Once again, this is Bill, bringing you my perspective on cable management.